to kick in the 1950s. Obviously, earlier during World War II, you had the development of UNIVAC and ENIAC in the United States, primarily for doing cheerful things like calculating missile trajectories and ballistic trajectories and so forth. That experience, though, helps to fuel the rise of scientific devices like the IBM 701 in 1952, which was really the first commercially available and widely used mainframe computer. One of the things that's really hysterical about all of this era, though, is that at some point in the late 1950s, Thomas Watson Jr., who at that point was running IBM, testified before Congress and basically said that he felt like the market for computers was just about saturated, that every company that he could imagine needing a computer had already purchased one or was going to purchase one. And so he wasn't sure, kind of where this industry was going to go. Well, obviously that changed a little bit. And again, a lot of this was driven by speed, was driven by increase in storage capacity, just tremendous advances happening very quickly. In terms of privacy, though, a couple of forces came together. So you've got the Social Security number, and the Social Security number is the ability to track wage earning, but it does in fact obviously identify a specific individual. Related to that is this idea that people are starting to travel more. They're starting to, the transportation system is improved. More and more people can afford to do flights. Businesses is moving from the local region to the national region. And it's not always convenient to carry large amounts of cash or to have access to a bank, so on and so forth. So there are two things that you really need in order to do an effective credit system in a country as big as the United States. Number one, you need a form of identification that specifies a given individual. And so you begin to see the linkage developing between a credit card number and the Social Security number. So that's number one. Number two is the availability of rapid data processing. And that turns the jets on for the computer industry, because now you've got all of this financial data that needs to be transferred at relatively high speeds, relatively, again, keeping in mind that a lot of times the data transmission would not occur until 2 a.m. when phone line charges were lower, and it would only happen once a day, and so on and so forth. So it was very archaic compared to what we're doing today, but still in terms of in comparison to doing it by mail, for instance, it was dramatically faster. But here's the thing. You're beginning to see at the end of World War II, moving into the early 1950s, the development of a credit economy in the United States. And that has, social and financial implications. I remember when I was doing American Privacy, it was just stunning to realize that the entire amount of American consumer debt at the end of World War II was something around the order of about $13 million. I think today it is in the multiple trillions of consumer debt. It's, we have really leaned into this concept. So there's that social and financial implication, and that's another talk altogether. But from a privacy perspective, what people don't even today necessarily think about all the time is that every single purchase that is done with a credit card becomes a data point for someone to analyze, to help generate advertising, to track spending patterns, to make business decisions about consumer trends, so on and so forth. Obviously, prior to the development of a credit economy, it was a cash economy. And there was really not much in the way of data collection. Yeah, maybe your local, grocery store might have some record of what you had ordered, or more likely your tailor would have records of what suits they had made and what your measurements were, so on and so forth. But all of that information was contained to whatever business it was that you had dealt with. Now, the credit card company is not a business that you have transacted with per se, but it is the funnel into which all of your purchases, all of your buying habits now flows. And so it gives these credit card companies enormous power very quickly. And obviously, it gives them a separate motivation to encourage you to use their credit card services, because the very act of using the credit card is adding to the information that they have, which potentially becomes another revenue stream. We see that, again, on steroids these days in terms of the purchases that we do with, Apple Pay, or we do it with, Google Pay or what have you. All of these purchases now are tied up in this drive for information. And we'll come back to that a little bit later, because, to a large extent, we are we're translating ourselves, we're shifting from a consumer to a service-based economy, and the lifeblood of that is information. And so, all of the services that we use are highly motivated to collect that information, because that is an important source of their revenues. Getting back to the federal law piece just briefly, because it's relevant to all of this, is Katz in 1967. So this is Katz versus United States. And actually, this is in fact a British, this is a British phone book taken in the city of Oxford. So for those of you who are temporarily confused, yes, I recognize that is not an American phone booth, but the same general principle still applies, in the sense that Mr. Katz was running a gambling operation, and the FBI attached a device to the outside of the phone booth that he liked to use to contact, his clients, his bookies, what have you. And they used that device to record his conversations, and then got a warrant to search his home and arrested him and so forth. And Mr. Katz took the case up to the Supreme Court and argued that the FBI did not have the right to listen into his conversation in a public place, and in particular, while he was standing in a booth in which he felt he had an expectation of privacy. And relying on the Brandeis dissent from 1928, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that, in fact, he did have an expectation of privacy, that the fact that he had enclosed himself within a phone booth meant that he created a zone of privacy around himself, and that law enforcement could not listen to that conversation without getting a search warrant to do so. And so that, this was, by the way, a decision of the Warren Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, former governor of California. The Warren Court is widely acknowledged to have been one of the most liberal in the United States, in United States history. And there are a lot of decisions that are very pro-individual rights that come out of this period, and this is certainly one of them. One of the things, though, from a right to privacy perspective, and I want to focus on the tech a little bit more than the law, but that concept of the right to privacy would spin out in a slightly different way in a series of cases that began at about this time. So you've got that phrase that Brandeis and Warren used in their law review article from 1890. Just about this same time, I think it was 1968, 67 or 68, there was a woman in the state of Connecticut who argued to the Supreme Court that a Connecticut law prohibiting her doctor from discussing birth control with her as a married woman was unconstitutional and a violation of her right to privacy. And the Warren Court, actually, this decision was written by Justice William Douglas. The Warren Court agreed, and they ruled, in fact, that when you look at what Douglas referred to as the penumbra or the shadow cast by the various rights of the Bill of Rights, that you see in that a federal right to privacy, a constitutional right to privacy that limits the ability of a state government to interfere in the conversations between a married woman and her doctor. And so that's really, when we talk about some of the other legal issues that involve a right to privacy, that's really where it gets started in Griswold versus Connecticut. Now, that's gone off in a very different direction, of course, because the next case in that series, which was a couple of years later, I think 69 or 70, was Eisenstadt v. Baird, which was a Massachusetts case. And the question in that case was, well, does the state of Massachusetts have the right to prohibit doctors from giving advice to unmarried women about birth control? And the Supreme Court, relying on Griswold, said no. As a matter of fact, that's also an unconstitutional intrusion into the private conversation between a woman and her doctor about a medical issue. And so that struck down the Massachusetts law banning conversations or discussions for unmarried women. And then you may see where this is going, which is in 1973, the question of whether or not the state has a legal ability to regulate conversations between a doctor and a woman over abortion. And there, the court, now under the leadership of Justice Berger, did not take an absolutist point of view, but what they said was that for the first trimester, they were using that language at the time, for the first trimester, a woman does have a right to privacy that trumps the state's interest. In the last trimester, the state's interest categorically trumps the woman's. And in the middle, the second trimester, there's a balancing test that gets applied. So one of the things, putting aside all of the other considerations that are wrapped up in it to the extent that you can, it's important to remember that Roe v. Wade at its core is a privacy case. And one of the unintended consequences that we may be grappling with if this iteration of the court ultimately abandons Roe is what impact that has on this concept of a federal right to privacy. Because I'm sure, for instance, that there would be some states that would be happy to revert back to a situation where they do ban unmarried people from getting advice about contraception from their doctors. And so we're going to have to sort out, how much of this quote unquote right to privacy could be unraveled if the court decides to move in that particular direction. But I think it's an important thing to understand in terms of how these legal concepts get picked up in judicial decisions and then how they transmute themselves over a period of time. Now, what makes all of this particularly fascinating and complicated is that you've got technology driving social change and legal change at the same time. So keep in mind, for instance, that, here's this decision in 1967 by the Supreme Court that makes it unequivocally clear that every single one of you listening right now to this, have a reasonable expectation of privacy, a zone of privacy that you enjoy if you make a phone call from a phone booth. At the same time, I'm willing to bet that the number of people listening to this lecture who have actually made a phone call from a phone booth, I could probably count on one hand. And actually, during the comments, I'd be curious to hear how many people have done so. But technology was going to take care of this issue very quickly. Before we get there, I did want to show people my first computer, which was the IBM 5150 from 1981. I got this, I got a version, I guess, that was a couple of years older in think it was 1983. That would be right, my junior year. This is just an absolute beast of a computer. It weighs about 55 pounds. Those floppy drives that you see there are 256 kilobytes each. So in order to make this thing function, you actually had to load the operating system for the computer first, and then you could take out the operating system and you could load a word processor or very rudimentary spreadsheet or what have you. I wrote I wrote my theses on this. I have a lot of fond memories, but not so much of hauling it up and down 3 flights of stairs at school. So and the other thing, of course, that is brutally painful is that yes, my original computer is now in a computer museum. So I guess that pretty well sums that up. We can jump from there, from 1983, 1984, into Google. And in the process of doing so, it is fair to say that we're skipping over a fair amount of technological history, particularly with respect to the production and distribution of personal information. Bulletin boards are going to get a fair amount of mention in my book, The Rise of the Digital Mob. Obviously, Timothy Berners-Lee developing the concept of the World Wide Web, again in the early 1980s. It gets launched in the mid-90s, absolutely explodes. As a matter of fact, you can really see Google as a response to that basically, with the release of the underlying structure in the first web server software and the first rudimentary browser software by Berners-Lee in 93. By 1996, 3 years later, you've got several thousand websites already around the world. And a couple of guys, Larry Page and Sergey Brin in California, get frustrated with trying to keep track of their bookmarks. And so they begin to organize their personal bookmark collection. And that quite literally is the origin of Google. And now here's one of their many, many, many data servers around the world. This is from an article talking about how Google has reached the point now where they're using artificial intelligence to track the cooling of their server centers and to maximize the ecological efficiency of them and so on and so forth. I mean, when you think about the fact that we are, the 25th anniversary of Google is coming up, that is not very much time. And also wrapped up in all of this, from a privacy perspective, is, one original precept of Brin and Page, which was to make all of the world's information accessible, which is why they've gotten into fights with book publishers about scanning books and yada, yada. And then, of course, the fact that they originally had wrapped up in their mission statement the very simple concept of don't be evil, and that has quietly drifted away from their corporate documents. So make of that what you will, but we live in a time where data accumulation and data aggregation and data mining are the driving forces for a lot of our both our social benefits and our social ills, and we will be in constant tension with that for some time to come. Part of the reason, and this is really where we start to get into the personal responsibility piece of that, part of the reason is that we are generating and contributing so much of the information that Google and Microsoft and Apple and so on and so forth collect and analyze and attempt to monetize. So in terms of the kind of footsteps that occurred along the way here, you've got the Motorola Dynatac from 1983, which was the first mobile phone. The key with all of this, even something as prosaic as the brick, as it was called, is that it's a location-based device. And now, even more so than what you see with respect to IP addresses or phone numbers for BBSs and all the rest of that, now we're seeing that the very devices that we are using are tied to where we physically are. And so now we've got this added layer of information, which is highly relevant to the people that are trying to monetize the world, because more often than not, where you are says something about what you're doing, what you're interested in buying, in many cases, how much you can afford. Are you traveling, are you traveling to the Cayman Islands or to St. Bart's, or are you traveling to Topeka, just to pick a contrary example? And I like Topeka, so there's no insult intended, but there's clearly going to be some assumptions that are made depending on where we are using these devices, and it becomes highly relevant to the data analysis that these companies are doing. The reason that that I put the SCP-5300 on the right, this is the first American phone that was capable of taking and transmitting pictures and some very, very preliminary videos. Again, these are postage stamps. The resolution, I think the Sanyo phone was 110,000 pixels compared to the most recent iPhone smartphone is, I think, 14 megapixels. So, the relative advances in the last 20 years, again, are staggering. But now you've got the ability of individuals to take photos, to share information, to add a visual component to what they're putting out into the world. And this is obviously relevant to the work that I do with teachers, with students and so forth, in terms of the potential disclosure of intimate information, whether or not it is appropriate for them to be taking pictures of certain things or not. There's this privacy issue of sharing information with people. Obviously, there's the potential for the information to be stolen and misused in different ways. And again, all of this is because we have the capability to produce and distribute this information, and we oftentimes don't think about what the potential consequences of doing so are. So let's get to our buddy Mark Zuckerberg. This is a photo from the early 2000s, not long after he created his well-known product FaceMash, which eventually gave way to the Facebook, and then at the suggestion of one of his investors, just Facebook, which is what we know about now. Like some other tech products, most notably Snapchat, kind of combination of sexual attitudes and misogyny was at the core of what was going on here. FaceMash was basically a program that Zuckerberg wrote to computerize a hot or not evaluation for his classmates, where the program went out into the world and collected the quote unquote Facebook photos of his classmates and randomly put them side by side and had people rank them and stuff like that. And not surprisingly, the good folks at Harvard took that down fairly quickly. And then he got the idea, instead of kind of scraping the data from the Facebook, why not literally electronify, why not literally create a digital Facebook that people could share and start trading information? And that was the origin of the behemoth that we have today. So, The Social Network, I think, is a fun movie. It plays a little bit fast and loose with some of the facts, as a lot of these things do. But I think it does do a pretty good job of capturing the kind of zeitgeist of the developmental process and the growth of the company. Obviously, another iconic figure in American technology, Steve Jobs. This is him holding up the very first iPhone in 2007. In January, the phone was actually released about 5 months later, and then 18 months after that, they got the Apple Store up and running. Just an amazing thing altogether. Number one, look how small the phone now seems compared to some of the max versions of the phone that are out there now. But the thing is that now we're putting a computer with all of its potential capabilities into the palm of our hand. And that really was, in fact, a world-changing invention. And it's actually really pretty remarkable that it was just 14 years ago that this was introduced, because when you think about the extent to which these devices have burrowed into our society over the course of those 14 years, it is, in fact, absolutely staggering. And, that's not even counting, I mean, I'm just talking about iPhones, but that's not even counting all of the Galaxy Notes that are out there, the various Android phones, so on and so forth. So there's just been a tremendous social impact for these little devices. And again, it's a combination of the data creation and the flexibility that these phones offer and the location data. And that really is the combination that has made these devices and social media so incredibly powerful in terms of collecting data from us. So here's just a few of the various social media networks that are out there. I think that this is one of the really remarkable things, that if you just take likes, put aside tweets or pins or snaps or anything else, just likes on Facebook, 13 trillion of them from as of a year ago. I mean, it's just a huge, huge pool of data that we voluntarily are giving to Facebook. And that's just one piece of it. That's not even counting the photos we upload. It's not counting the comments, the posts, the shares, everything else that we do just on that one social media service. And then when you start looking at all of these other things, obviously there's a couple here that have gone the way of the dodo, but more and more keep coming around. Like this does not, for instance, reflect WeChat or WhatsApp or some of the others that have popped up. So again, on a day-to-day basis, each and every one of us, to one degree or another, is fueling this tremendous collection of information and data. And by and large, that may not feel like a huge problem. It may not be fully at a crisis level for you. That's something you need to decide. You may well be disturbed by the fact that when you go onto your browser, if you've done a search for shoes, you're going to get shoe ads for the next week. It may disturb you that you walk past a Starbucks and all of a sudden a message comes in offering you a coupon for your next latte. That may not bother you, it may. But the thing is that, those are trivial examples compared to the potential for this information to be used to harm individuals, or frankly, to harm society as a whole. A lot of my work actually involves talking to people who have been victims of what I refer to as electronic sexual assault, sort of more colloquially known as revenge porn. Individuals who thought that their information was either confidential or protected, or that they had shared it with someone that they could trust. And they subsequently found out that none of those things were true. And so what do you do about that? How do you try to pull that down? I've worked with school districts that have discovered that images that were being passed around by kids, mostly guys, to be honest, are now being or have now been uploaded to foreign web servers where they can't be removed. And again, all of this is a direct function of the fact that, to use the phrase that arose in the early 80s, information wants to be free. And back in the early 80s, what they were talking about was that, oh my God, this thing called the internet is absolutely phenomenal. And if we can connect to it, the cost of distributing information is essentially zero. And that's by and large true. I mean, the cost of sending bits from me to you guys is pretty close to zero, all things considered. But what the individual, his name was Stuart Brand, what Brand didn't really kind of elaborate upon, but I think has become evident as time has gone on, is that information has almost an organic quality to it, which is to say that when we create information, particularly in a digital format, it's extraordinarily hard to keep that information from escaping and from going out into the world in ways that we may not anticipate. And once it does so, we've lost that control, which is, as I said at the beginning of all of this, really the essence of privacy. And so, if we really want to be private individuals, at the end of the day, we need to make a conscious decision not to create certain kinds of information. And we're always being offered a trade-off, right? So I've used Gmail now for just about 14 years, actually. And it's a terrific service. I really rely on it, obviously. But I do so with the awareness that, computers are scanning the emails that I write and serving up ads that the algorithm thinks may be relevant to the work that I'm doing or the interests. I've like so many people have been doing sourdough baking for the last few months. Actually, you'll get a kick out of the fact that I named my starter Hamilton. But it is not uncommon for me to get ads that are relevant to sourdough baking because I'm talking about it to my family and so forth. So, you recognize that there are these trade-offs. The issue is, what do you do if the information is used in ways that you don't accept or you don't like? And that becomes much, much more difficult to deal with. Probably the single best example of that is the company Cambridge Analytica, which no longer exists, but has been succeeded by various spin-offs. So I don't think that the underlying threat has gone away. But in short, the concept of Cambridge Analytica was that they used nefarious means to get access to huge quantities of Facebook information. And the famous quote, I think it was from Steve Bannon or someone else, that Cambridge Analytica had somewhere on the order of 5,000 data points for every single person in the United States. And that was the information that they used in 2012, but then much more specifically in 2016 to tailor Facebook ads, in particular for the Trump campaign. And it's a legitimate question given the narrowness of of Trump's victory in 2016 in the 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Did those targeted Facebook ads make a difference? Should we be concerned about that? Is that somehow illegal? Or is the psychological profile that Cambridge Analytica was able to develop, is that just a bridge too far? Do they know too much about us? And do we even have a right to complain if they're using information that we ourselves put out into the world? How do we balance those competing concerns? Because, again, without the combination of the information we provide and the computing power and the location information and all the rest of it, that wouldn't have happened. But it obviously did. And it's only going to get worse because the amount of data in the speed with which it can all be collated and analyzed and mined and so forth is not going to slow down. And actually now, because we're starting to see artificial intelligence come into play with all of this, you have machines and algorithms that are basically programming themselves to be more efficient in how they handle all of this. So that's really the lecture for the next time. But hopefully you come away with this with some things to think about in terms of your own personal engagement with these online services. So now I'm more than happy to throw it open to some questions. I do want to say before we start off with all of that, that I'm more than happy to talk to people offline in one way or another. All of my contact information is here. So certainly feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we can do that. But I know that we've got some time for Q&A now.
Thanks so much, Frederick. I already got a bunch of questions from my kids, so I'm sure there will be some. If you want to leave that up, people can copy that info as well.
Yeah, sure.
Acuna, would you like to take over for moderating the Q&A? Just 1 second. Just 1 second. I'll step over while Acuna jumps back here. So a couple of things. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. You can directly message myself or Acuna, and both of us will ask our questions to. You said you prefer to go by Frederick, right?
Fred, please.
Fred, awesome. Fred, you got it. Fred, you can ask your questions in chat. You can ask to have me call on you, and I'll call on you to get to ask them. Or if you feel it's a private question or a tough question, you can definitely send those to a PM to myself, and we'll read them for you. So the first question I got from one of my kids goes like so, Fred. They said, thanks so much for your info. I really appreciate the historical perspective. Going forward into the future, where do you foresee privacy issues changing and evolving?
A couple of things. I think the most important thing is that I think that we will, and we certainly need to, do a really good job in terms of educating people about what the privacy risks are that they face and what they can do to retain control of their information. And obviously, as you'll probably gather, I think the first answer to that is by being very mindful of what you create and what you share. I think also there will be greater regulation coming out of particularly Washington. The European Union has already been a leader with respect to this, but there'll be greater regulation coming out in terms of recourse for individuals whose data is misused, or giving consumers more ability to pull their information back from these services if they change their mind. It's a little bit like if you send a photo to someone you're in a relationship with and you want to get that photo back from them, you should have a right to do so. And the same should be true for these online services that we use, like Facebook and Google and so forth.
Awesome. And the next question I had here was, I had this as well. I'm glad somebody asked. They were watching some of your previous work in your Jon Stewart famous clip where you were talking about obscenity and decency. And our discourse has really changed since that time. We had I'm guessing by that date, there was a Republican president talking about religious issues and speaking politely or respectfully, and things have evolved quite a bit since then. What do you think of the current state of political discourse, and how do you think online discussions, social media, digital news, and the movement away from newspapers and elsewhere, how do you think that has affected our decency and our discourse? And it's kind of a two-parter. And what's a good line, right? We talked about obscenity, but what about just respectful communication? Where's the line in these things? I know it's kind of a loaded question with two parts.
It's a really, really good question. I can only speak for myself that I think I'm swearing a lot more than I used to. because of the current political situation. Look, if you looked at that Jon Stewart clip, I mean, it's hysterical when you think about how much things have changed in 14 years in terms of decency and online discourse and all the rest of that. Regardless of what your particular political predilections may be, I think it is fair to say that the last 4 years has featured an administration that has not necessarily set the best example for how people should communicate with each other online. We need to really focus on the institutions in our society that encourage civil discourse between people. And that could be your religious organizations, it should be the schools, it should be local officials who know the people that they represent. Honestly, it should be the family unit. I will say, I am conscious of this, that if I am communicating on a service that I know my mother reads, I am more likely to be as respectful as I should be. Um, we at the end of the day, I mean, look, a good chunk of my work now focuses on cyber ethics. At the end of the day, we have an ethical obligation to behave in appropriate ways. And we need to think, each and every one of us, about what our personal ethical values are. And if we do that, at the very least, we can say to ourselves, I have acted in a way that I believe is appropriate and is respectful to other people. And that's, I really do believe in the concept that each one of us has the potential to cause ripples in the communities in which we belong. And I think that's important. I really do. I do think that we need to re-engage with the concept of personal responsibility and our obligation to others and to the society as a whole. It's interesting because at the same time, I did my first book in 2000 was Obscene Profits, about the rise of the online adult industry. And then in 2004, I did The Decency Wars, which was the book that Jon Stewart did the interview on. And I actually don't have a problem with sexuality as part of the kind of public scene or the public space. I actually have much more of a problem with violence, which I think is much more destructive to society as a whole. So I think when we talk about decency, we too often mean sexuality, when in fact, really, we should be talking about violence and bullying and threats to others. But that's just a small editorial for this.
I appreciate it. I'd love to ask a follow-up, but now Acuna, I think, has a DM that somebody asked. Acuna, do you want to go with that? When Acuna reconnects, I think she's having a little tech issue.
Okay.
I did have a question for you on that as a follow-up. Why do you think it is that in the United States, I think I remember once, and I'm not going to go into the details, but there's a stand-up comedy routine where somebody said they recall watching SVU, where somebody in detail discussed sexual assault, violence, murder, in really graphic detail. They showed the dead body, they showed the shooting taking place. And then they had that episode nearly not air because for 0.5 seconds, there was a slight part of a butt cheek that was exposed when somebody got out of a shower. And that created all the controversy in that episode of Law and Order. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on why do you think in America we have so much more taboo around issues about sexuality, or even just very generic sexuality or expressions of affection versus violence?
Yeah, no, a lot of it has to do with, the various religious strands that are woven through American history, American culture, American law. There, actually, my wife, Amy Wirbel, did a book called Lust on Trial, which was about this 19th century postal inspector named Anthony Comstock, who tried to suppress obscenity traveling through the mails. I mean, he completely failed, but he did get some language into the laws that has basically been used to try to suppress sexual speech for, the better part of 120, well, God, no, 150 years as of 2023. So, he himself was a devoutly Christian moralist, and that strand runs through American culture. I think related to that is this, sort of, there's always been a little bit of a glorification of violence in American culture. The Westerner, the kind of cowboy mythos and all the rest of that. So, those I think are competing forces. I do think for the health of our society, it should be reversed. I think that if more work was done to limit violence, particularly with respect to women, and we were more accepting of sexuality and even nudity as part of our culture, overall, we would be much healthier. And this is, I will admit, purely an editorial point of view, but having studied this stuff for a while now, I think we have it absolutely backwards.
Akuna, go for it. I think you had a question.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a question that was a DM in the chat. And so if the person wants to message me again because I'm not getting at exactly what you're asking, then please chat me again. But this person has a question about individualist notions of privacy and how systems of racism and heteropatriarchy recast the questions of genealogy of the PROS Act.
Genealogy of the what?
So sorry, that was supposed to be privacy. That was just an autocorrect.
Oh, of privacy. Okay, so I'll read again. This person has a question about individualist notions of privacy and how systems of racism and heteropatriarchy recast the questions of privacy. That makes more sense.
Well, I will say right off the bat that sounds like the kind of thing I would spend a couple of months doing a paper on. It's a really, really provocative question. Let me see if I can parse this out. When you look at the scope of American history, I guess I would come almost immediately to the concept of a rugged individualism, right? As being sort of an ethos that we see driving the way in which we interact with the government. I think that I would layer into that question the concept of libertarianism, this idea that we have this right to be left alone. And I think that is really at the core of some of these arguments, for instance, about face masks, about other kinds of governmental regulations. To the extent that those are wrapped up in kind of racial issues or kind of a heteronormative approach to things, I'll be honest with you, I think I would have to do more research and analysis, because those are complicated concepts that don't immediately connect to privacy in my head, but I could see where they might. It's an interesting question. If you look at this concept of privacy, this ability to control your information, that's going to get into issues of power and control that run across society, right? I mean, so, in terms of how women are treated online, by way of example, there's absolutely no question that female privacy is less protected and under greater assault than kind of your hetero male privacy. That because we have this warped perspective with respect to sexuality, there's such a premium on invading the privacy of women that those kind of gender issues come into play. I think that you could, and I'm again, this is very much off the cuff, but I think you could see some of these privacy issues playing out in a racial context with respect to a racial/economic context, in the sense that privacy is a commodity. The ability to control your information is a function of wealth and a function of your power in the society as a whole. So, if you're economically disadvantaged, for instance, just to focus on the economic piece, you're going to have to give up more information to function in the world, because you'll come under greater scrutiny from banks, under greater scrutiny from government, so on and so forth, than someone who has a great deal of money, who can, in a sense, buy their privacy. And in many ways, obviously, you could look at the Epstein case as being a function of that. There's someone who purchased privacy quite literally from federal prosecutors. I'm making an assertion here, I'll be absolutely clear, but that seems to me to be the direction in which the investigation by the Miami Herald was leading. So, I think that's a really fascinating question, and I definitely want to give that some more thought.
Akuna, did you have one more?
Hi, folks. I have one more question in the chat. I think this might have come from one of our middle school debaters. And so the question here is, how might I convince my mom to let me have a TikTok? So that
I think that's an absolutely wonderful question. And my answer would be that you should have a series of conversations with your mother about why you want to have a TikTok and what value you think that it would provide to you. And value can just be entertainment. I mean, it's okay to use some of these things for entertainment, but I think that it is important for you in that conversation with your mother to ask what her concerns are and take them seriously, and have a debate as necessary to discuss the competing concerns. For instance, she may be concerned that you will release information or provide information to the world that could be harmful to you in some way, or she may be concerned that it will distract you from your other activities, or she may be concerned that it will undercut some of the values that are important for your family. And you need to hear what her thoughts are, and she needs to listen seriously to why you want to do it. And this is the kind of conversation that I really encourage parents and kids to have as often as possible, because it's good not to have a knee-jerk reaction on either side to these kinds of questions.
Thanks, Fred. And one more middle schooler followed up and asked, do you think that our understanding of privacy is keeping up with the technology?
Excellent question. I would say that it is starting to. One of the things that I've experienced when I've talked to kids at various school districts is that they often are much more aware of the privacy concerns even than some of the adults are. And I've also found out that kids can be fairly sophisticated in terms of how they handle social media channels. So, for instance, I've had some kids explain that they might have a social media ID that they use to post activities that they want their college admissions officer to see, and then they'll have a social media ID that they share with their family, and then maybe they have one that's just for their friends. And I think that that's fine. I think that it is important to be honest with your parents about what you're doing, because your parents have a right and an obligation to know how you're using social media. But it's not necessarily a bad thing to realize at a young age that some material is appropriate for some audiences and not for others.
Thanks for that, Frederick. And I got a two-parter here.
Yeah.
First of which is, how do you balance the need for anonymity online versus something you've talked about a lot, which is the risk of cyberbullying, cyber assault, cyber sexual exploitation, etc., or even terrorism recruitment? How do we balance the need for anonymity along with the need for transparency when it comes to online work, especially in view of things like corporations as well, being transparent with posting versus creating, quote, bot armies?
Really smart question. I'm grappling with this right now in terms of writing The Rise of the Digital Mob, right? The question of anonymity, I think, is at the core of that discussion. Anonymity has a positive value in society, or it can, in the sense that if you are someone who is not powerful and you're trying to challenge someone who is, or raise concerns about their behavior, anonymity enables you to do that with less fear of retribution. So a good example of that are the whistleblower laws that protect people who come forward and in general give people an opportunity to say, hey, a government official is doing something wrong and I want you to know about it without giving up my identity. And that can be a very powerful tool. The question you raise, I think, is a very good one, which is that unfortunately, casual anonymity enables trolling, it enables bullying, it enables cyber harassment of one kind or another. And I'm grappling with that. I don't know how you balance these competing concerns. I think an argument can be made that companies that provide a platform for speech that is then used for bullying may have to impose transparency in order to protect the people who are using their platform. And you can see that, for instance, with Facebook. It's not obviously, it's not like Facebook is free of harassment, but at least it is much more difficult to create a fake account on Facebook than it is on something like Twitter or WhatsApp or something like that. So I think that it needs to be made on a social network case by case basis. But I think we can figure out ways to preserve the value of anonymity in some situations and maybe lessen its harm in others.
And here's the one final question. As a former debater yourself, who sounds like you're very active in high school and university level, is there anything you now understand from working in the real world and getting like kind of the purpose of our the namesake of this, getting outside of the round and getting outside of the debate space? What are some realizations that you've had being in the real world that back when you were a debater, whether it be high school or college level, and you were talking about these issues around privacy, not as much was online back then, but anonymity, the rights to privacy, like you say, go back hundreds of years. what are some understandings and realizations you've had now that you wish you had had back then that you could have brought into the round when you were debating?
That's an interesting question. Well, let me say, for starters, I don't actually recall that we debated privacy very much when I was going through these various debating programs. I will say that in terms of debate, the going in two different directions. What I wish I could have brought into debate back then is even more reading um, of good news sources, more reading of language and dialogue. I think that the extent to which you can provide depth to your arguments, the better off you are. And one of the things, and this is an interesting transition from on topic to off topic in college. With on topic, there was so little flexibility. It was very rote. It was very granular, very detailed, and a lot less fun. And I think that one of the things that was great about off topic was it forced you to be creative. It encouraged this creative kind of free form approach to the arguments that you were making. And it wasn't that they were nonsensical or off the wall, but just that because the topics themselves were non-traditional, you were forced to be creative in terms of how you turned it into some kind of legitimate policy argument, which of course was the goal of the debate. Going the other way, having had 30 plus years to think about this, I will tell you that the benefits of doing debate are absolutely endless. If you end up having to do interviews with people, or you're in a discussion in a corporation, or even in your relationship, it's a huge advantage to having had debate training and that experience. So I think that I'm very grateful that I enjoyed it and that I was drawn to it when I was going through school. Looking back on it, I think that the schools at all levels could have done more to encourage students to engage in these kinds of activities across the curriculum, because the skills are so valuable. As a matter of fact, when you look back on it, and you want to, this, I can honestly say predates my schooling, but we used to have rhetoric as part of our educational program. And there was an expectation that people would learn poetry and they would learn to deliver poems and speeches from plays. And then you would debate and you would have these give and takes. And actually, someone was talking about civil discourse. That's where you learn some of this, is that you learn how to interact with people who are diametrically opposed to what you're saying. Now, they may not believe it because everybody kind of takes a position, but still, in the heat of the debate, you have to listen to what they're saying and you have to come up with arguments that rebut their point of view. That's what we should be doing in society. And you can't just stand up and call people names. It doesn't work. So, from my perspective, debate has been a gift that keeps on giving, and I'm really fortunate that I got a chance to do it, and I'm very psyched for you guys that you are.
All right,
Thank you
Akina,
so
did you have
much
any other questions?
No, I think that's it in the chat. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Fred for his time. You've been very generous, especially because for a moment, I forgot you are on the East Coast. So we so appreciate you joining us at this hour for you. This has been amazing. There are some students who were emailing me that they had to go to dinner and they said, are you going to put that recording up? And so I know that I'm going to be fast about putting this recording up so that those students can have access to it. Thank you so much, Fred, for, not only sharing about your topic. I really appreciated you offering the historical point of view, because we do have some students who debate these social media topics all of the time, but they don't get that background in terms of ways to think about privacy and a way to really frame that understanding of what privacy is and how it's changed over time in addressing these topics. So that was amazing.
Oh, good.
I'm
Well,
sure there's some parents who probably would love to to have your ear for another 30 minutes. We might have to have you back for part 2 next semester, but
I'd be delighted. And let me tell you, I mean, just a couple of quick points. I mean, you know, as a writer and given the books that I've done, the historical perspective I think is so important. And I really hope the kids will take away from this the idea that it's always worthwhile to look a little bit more deeply into the origins of whatever topic they're talking about. So there's that. And then you know, the other thing, and I truly mean this, if there's any follow-up, if there's anything I can do to help going forward with these kids or with the program, just let me know. I'm happy to do it.
all right, everyone, you heard that. So you already know that we're going to see Fred again next semester. We do not turn down talent. So thank you so much, Fred. I so appreciate you. And then everyone have a good night. East Coast people, thank you so much for sticking with us. Everyone have a great night.
And be safe, everyone.
Thanks
Take
so
care.
much. Yeah, the whole Parley community really appreciates it, Fred. Thanks for giving back after all these years.